What does it take for a person to vanish, not just from sight, but from memory? To slip into the cracks of history, their name fading, their story reduced to a brief headline, or a whispered rumor passed down through generations? In the quiet town of Biddeford, Maine, at the turn of the 20th century, that's exactly what happened to a young woman named Cordelia Poirier. Her name once carried weight in hushed voices, a name tied to tragedy, to mystery, and to a crime that shocked even those accustomed to hardship. The case became one of the most haunting and cruel murders ever recorded in New England's small-town history. It was the summer of 1897, and the people of Biddeford were preparing for another humid Maine season. The town, nestled by the Saco River, was a close-knit industrial community, its streets filled with the hum of textile mills and the laughter of children playing near the docks. But beneath that everyday normalcy, tensions ran deep. Poverty, long working hours, and whispers of scandal created an undercurrent of unease. And then came the day everything changed. Cordelia, a quiet, hard-working young woman of just 22, was found brutally murdered in her family home. The details of her death were so horrifying that newspapers of the time struggled to print them. Her throat had been slashed, her body left in a position that suggested anger, or perhaps something even darker. In a matter of hours, the Poirier home became the epicenter of fear, gossip, and accusation. The murder drew attention, not just because of its brutality, but because of who Cordelia was, an ordinary girl caught in extraordinary evil. And in a town like Biddeford, where everyone knew each other, the question loomed larger than ever. Who could have done such a thing? The investigation that followed would expose deep divisions between class and gender, between truth and rumor. Some saw it as a tragic case of passion gone wrong, others as a calculated act of violence. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into years, one truth remained. Nothing about Cordelia's murder made sense. Her story was more than just a murder. It was a mirror reflecting the fears, injustices, and secrets of her time. And even now, more than a century later, the name Cordelia Poirier still lingers in the shadows, her case echoing like a warning across generations. But was the truth ever really uncovered? Or, like so many haunting mysteries before it, was it quietly buried, along with the young woman who never got to tell her side of the story? Because sometimes the real horror isn't the crime itself. It's how easily we allow it to be forgotten. Before her name became linked with tragedy, Cordelia Poirier was simply known as a kind, soft-spoken young woman, the sort of person neighbors described as good-hearted and steady. She was born in Biddeford, Maine, in 1875, the eldest daughter of French-Canadian immigrants who had come seeking work in the bustling textile mills that lined the Saco River. Her parents, Marie and Jean Poirier, were among the countless families who made up the backbone of the town's working class, proud, weary, and endlessly resilient. From an early age, Cordelia was different. Where others complained about the endless noise of the looms or the stifling heat of the factory floors, she seemed to find small comforts in the rhythm of her work. She was known to hum quietly as she spun thread, her voice barely audible over the machines. One former coworker later recalled, she never had a bad word for anyone, always smiled, even when the rest of us were too tired to talk. At just 12 years old, Cordelia had begun working in the mills to help support her family. By her early 20s, she had already spent most of her life inside those factory walls, a world of routine and fatigue, where the days bled into one another. And yet, those who knew her best said she always carried herself with a quiet grace. Her younger sister, Anne, once described her as the glue that held the family together. When her mother fell ill, it was Cordelia who cooked, cleaned, and made sure her siblings were fed. When her father's pay was short, it was Cordelia who picked up extra shifts. She was, in every sense, a caretaker, not because she had to be, but because she wanted to be. Still, beneath that composed exterior, there were hints of longing. Friends said she sometimes spoke of wanting something more, a different life, far from the noise of the mills and the narrow streets of Biddeford. She had dreams of becoming a teacher, of seeing the world beyond Maine, but in a time when opportunities for young women were scarce. Dreams like that often remained just that, dreams. She was also known for her kindness toward those who had little. On Sundays, after attending Mass at St. Joseph's Church, she would often bring bread to an elderly widow who lived alone down the road. That girl had a heart of gold, one local woman later told a reporter. She couldn't pass by someone in need without helping. But not everyone viewed Cordelia through such warm eyes. In a town as small as Biddeford, where gossip spread faster than the tides, kindness could be mistaken for flirtation, and independence could be seen as rebellion. Cordelia was friendly with many, including some of the young men who worked at the mill. One of them, Thomas Landry, was said to be particularly close to her. Some claimed the two were courting. Others whispered that he was already involved with someone else. No one could say for sure what the truth was, and perhaps that uncertainty became part of what doomed her. Her family described her as cautious and proper, the kind of girl who would rather stay home sewing than attend rowdy dances. But even then, Cordelia was growing up in a world that often punished women for the simplest acts of independence. Being young, unmarried, and kind-hearted was sometimes enough to draw the wrong kind of attention in the days leading up to her death. Several witnesses recalled seeing Cordelia walking alone near the edge of town. One shopkeeper later remembered, she looked troubled that week. Not sick, just distracted. What weighed on her mind in those final days? Was it a secret she carried, a betrayal she'd learned of, or simply exhaustion from a life that had offered so little rest? Whatever the reason, Cordelia's story, her quiet resilience, her hidden dreams, her unspoken fears, makes her more than just a name in an old newspaper clipping. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and that's what makes her fate so haunting. She wasn't someone living on the edge of danger or rebellion. She was an ordinary young woman, trying to find her place in the world. But as history has shown time and again, even the most ordinary lives can end in the most extraordinary and horrifying ways. Friends would later say that the last time they saw her, she smiled and waved as she crossed the street, the late summer sun lighting her face. She looked so alive, one said quietly. Who could have imagined it would be the last time? Because in just a few short days, the kindness that defined her life would be replaced by the brutality of her death. A contrast so stark, it still chills those who hear her story today. The morning had none of the drama the evening would hold. Mills along the Saco River opened on time. Whistles blew. Men and women filed through the gates in their usual procession. Cordelia Poirier woke before dawn, as she always did, and worked through the small rituals that steadied her boiling water for coffee, sweeping the narrow kitchen, smoothing her hair into a tidy bun. A neighbor saw her pass the bakery at 8, her basket held close, the summer light catching the edge of her shawl. To anyone watching, she looked like every other young woman who kept her head down and kept moving. Her shift at the mill ran until mid-afternoon. Co-workers later remembered her at her loom, fingers steady, humming the same soft tune she always hummed. She was there, one woman would tell investigators, doing her job as if the world hadn't a thing to do with her. Yet even amid the clatter of machinery, some noticed a distance in her eyes that day in absence, as if some thought sat heavy behind her smile. At 2 o'clock, a passerby reported seeing Cordelia on Main Street, stopping briefly outside the haberdasher's. She exchanged a few words with Thomas Landry. The young man talk had linked to her for months. Their conversation, according to the witness, was low and hurried. Thomas walked away first, shoulders tight. Cordelia stayed a moment longer, watching him go, then turned toward the river. If the witness's memory is accurate, Cordelia tucked a small folded note into her palm before crossing toward the docks. What was written on that paper, if anything, would become one of the small, haunting mysteries of the case. By late afternoon, the heat pressed on the town. Cordelia was seen again near the riverbank, this time speaking with a man in a gray cap no one could identify for certain. Another eyewitness described a voice raised in anger. A third insisted they had seen a quiet exchange and then two figures parting. The contradictions multiplied like ripples on water. One person's certainty became another's fog. Could anyone have predicted at those ordinary meetings an errand, a word exchanged, a folded scrap of paper, would be the last ordinary things Cordelia would do? As dusk settled, the docks emptied and the mills slowed. Neighbors later recalled Cordelia walking the lane toward her boarding house with a borrowed book tucked beneath her arm. She waved to Mrs. Devereux, who was sweeping her stoop, and smiled in that soft, habitual way that put other people at ease. In those moments, she appeared as she had been all her life, unremarkable, approachable, alive in a way that made the violence that followed all the more jarring. Sometime after 9, someone reported seeing a light in the Poirier family parlor. Too late, too restless to be merely a lamp. A few blocks away, a shopkeeper heard a scuffle in the alley behind his store, a sound like two bodies grappling, followed by the muffled thud of something heavy dropping. He told a reporter later that he had been too frightened to look out. Another resident swore they had seen a man hurry away from the Poirier house, his hat pulled low, hands shoved into his pockets. The accounts diverged. Was it a single assailant or more than one? Was the violence sudden or the culmination of a confrontation? When Cordelia failed to return that night, alarm spread quickly. A small search was mounted, neighbors with lanterns, concerned friends calling her name into the darkness. They found nothing at first. No footprints on the dusty lane, no abandoned scrap of cloth, no sign that a struggle had crossed the town common. It was as if the evening had swallowed whatever had happened whole. The discovery came at dawn. A child walking to fetch water found a discarded scarf near the river, its edge stained. Not long after, the parish bell tolled in a way it never had before, slow, mournful, carrying the weight of a town that had just realized its safety had been pierced. When they finally found Cordelia, the scene was brutal and bewildering. The details would later be cataloged in coroner's notes, in newspaper leads, in whispered prayers. For now, the dominant feeling was this: an ordinary day turned to ruin with a violence no one in Biddeford felt prepared to name. So we ask ourselves, as witnesses and as historians, could anyone have predicted what was about to happen? Could those small, otherwise forgettable moments, people passing on a street, a folded piece of paper pressed into a hand, have been the last recognizable acts of a life? When we look back, the day unspools into a sequence of ordinary gestures, each one now heavy with meaning. And that is the most unsettling thing of all, how quickly the mundane can tilt into the monstrous, leaving us to sift the fragments and ask what, if anything, might have been done differently. The following morning, Biddeford woke to a strange stillness, the kind that often settles before news turns to panic. The factory bells rang at 6, as they always did, but fewer workers showed up that day. Whispers had begun even before the mill doors opened. Someone had seen something by the river. Someone else claimed a girl was missing. At first, it was nothing more than rumor, the kind of idle talk that carried easily in small towns. But by mid-morning, those whispers hardened to something far darker. Just after dawn, a young boy named Samuel Frost had gone to the riverbank to fetch water for his family. It was a chore he'd done countless times before, walking barefoot along the damp grass. But that morning, something caught his eye, a scarf tangled in the reeds. When he bent to pick it up, he noticed the dark stains across the fabric, thick and brown against the faded blue thread. As he followed the trail upstream, he saw a hand, pale and motionless, jutting out from the water. Samuel ran home screaming. Within minutes, half the town had gathered by the river's edge. Some stood in silence. Others crossed themselves and whispered prayers. The mill foreman, Mr. Davenport, was the first to identify her. "That's Cordelia," he said quietly. "That's Poirier's girl." The scene that followed was something out of a nightmare. Cordelia's body was pulled from the water and laid gently on the embankment, her hair matted, her clothes torn. There were bruises along her arms, and her face bore the unmistakable marks of violence. The sight alone sent a wave of disbelief through the crowd. Many had known her since childhood. To see her now, lifeless, broken, felt impossible. Word spread through Biddeford like wildfire. By noon, hundreds had gathered outside the Poirier home, where her mother sat on the porch, face in her hands, unable to speak. Neighbors brought food, candles, prayers, anything to fill the void of helplessness that had suddenly descended on the town. For a place like Biddeford, where crime rarely stretched beyond drunken brawls or petty theft, murder was unthinkable, especially murder of a young woman so beloved, so harmless. And so, fear began to creep into the corners of everyday life. Doors were locked for the first time. Curtains stayed drawn at night. Parents warned their daughters not to walk alone. The local constable, James Colburn, was the first officer to arrive at the scene. He had little experience with homicide. Few in Maine did at the time, but he knew enough to see that Cordelia's death was no accident. The area around the riverbank showed signs of a struggle. Footprints, some large, some smaller, were pressed deep into the mud. Nearby, a broken comb and a single button lay half buried beneath the reeds. By mid-afternoon, the county sheriff and a small investigative team had arrived. They took statements, sketched the area, and noted every detail that might hint at who had done this. Yet, as they moved through the evidence, one unsettling truth emerged. No one had heard anything. No screams, no cries for help. Whatever had happened, it had unfolded swiftly and silently. When the coroner's report was released 2 days later, it confirmed what many feared. Cordelia had been attacked. Her cause of death likely strangulation before being dragged into the river. The violence was personal, deliberate. It wasn't a robbery. Nothing of value had been taken. Whoever killed her had done so with intent. The newspapers wasted no time turning her story into headlines. "Young woman slain in Biddeford," one read. Another called it "a crime most heinous," the town in shock. Reporters from nearby Portland arrived to interview locals, twisting their grief into speculation. Some suggested a jealous lover. Others whispered of a stranger seen wandering the town in the days prior. But no one really knew. As night fell, the streets grew eerily quiet. Families huddled indoors, and the air seemed heavier somehow, as though the town itself was holding its breath. The once familiar hum of mill life had been replaced by unease, a sense that something sacred had been broken. The town that once felt safe, one resident told a journalist, is now cloaked in fear. And indeed, that was the feeling that lingered everywhere, in the glances exchanged between neighbors. In the silence that followed each question, no one wanted to answer. Funeral bells rang 3 days later. Cordelia's coffin, small and simple, was carried through the streets by men who could barely look at one another. Women wept openly. Even the river, that same river that had taken her, seemed to flow more slowly that day, as though burdened by guilt. In the wake of her death, Biddeford was no longer just a mill town. It was a place haunted by memory, with the soft echo of her voice, her laughter. Her quiet kindness lingered long after she was gone, and beneath all the mourning, Another feeling began to take root, one that would grow stronger with each passing day: the need for answers. Who would do such a thing to Cordelia Poirier? And more importantly, why? Because if someone in Biddeford was capable of this, then who among them could truly be trusted? In the days following Cordelia Poirier's murder, Biddeford became a place divided between grief and suspicion. The mill still operated, but the laughter and idle chatter that once filled its corridors had vanished. Now people spoke in whispers, cautious, watchful, and afraid of saying too much. Everyone wanted justice for Cordelia. But in a town this small, where everyone knew one another, the terrifying truth was unavoidable. Her killer was likely one of their own, Sheriff Thomas Bickford, a man known more for settling bar fights than solving homicides. Suddenly found himself at the center of a case that drew statewide attention. He began his investigation where any good sheriff would, by retracing Cordelia's final known steps. Witnesses placed her leaving the factory shortly before dusk that Friday evening. She was seen walking alone toward home, her small shawl wrapped tight against the chill. But somewhere between the mill and her front door, she vanished. The sheriff's first task was to question those closest to her, and naturally, his attention turned to the Poirier family. Cordelia's mother, Clara Poirier, was overcome with grief and barely coherent when interviewed. But her father, Joseph Poirier, became an immediate point of contention. A reserved and temperamental man, Joseph was known around town for his strictness and quick temper. Several neighbors claimed to have overheard shouting in the Poirier home days before Cordelia's death. Some even alleged that Joseph disapproved of a young man his daughter had recently been speaking to. Sheriff Bickford took note of this, but tread carefully. It wasn't uncommon for working-class families to clash, especially under financial strain. Still, whispers began to swirl that perhaps the tragedy had begun not by the river, but inside Cordelia's own home. Joseph maintained his innocence. He told the sheriff that he had been working late at the mill that evening and returned home after dark to find his daughter missing. His co-workers confirmed part of that story, though one mentioned a Joseph leaving earlier than usual, sometime around sunset. He seemed agitated, the man said. Didn't say why. Could a father's anger have turned into something far more sinister? Or were these rumors born of fear, twisting ordinary frustrations into imagined violence? Next, attention turned to Henry Lavoie, a 20-year-old factory worker who often worked alongside Cordelia. Several young women mentioned that Henry had shown an uncomfortable interest in her, complimenting her hair, lingering too long when she spoke, even following her after work on more than one occasion. When questioned, Henry appeared nervous but cooperative. He claimed that he had admired Cordelia from a distance, but denied any improper behavior. He also insisted he had been at a friend's house playing cards the night of the murder, a statement his friends supported, though their recollections were hazy after a night of drinking. Still, the sheriff couldn't ignore that. Henry's description matched a figure a witness claimed to have seen near the river around dusk. When asked directly if he had followed Cordelia that evening, Henry hesitated. "I might have seen her," he finally admitted, "but I didn't harm her. I swear it." But his words did little to calm suspicion. Many in town already believed Henry to be unstable, not cruel, perhaps, but volatile. And when rumors spread that his jacket had been found with traces of mud and what appeared to be blood near the hem, those whispers grew louder. Yet when tested, the stains turned out to be nothing more than rust and dirt. Henry was released, though the damage to his reputation was permanent. While locals argued over whether Cordelia's killer was her father or Henry, others clung to a more chilling theory that the murderer was a stranger. Several days before the killing, townsfolk reported seeing an unfamiliar man loitering near the edge of the mill yard. He was described as unkempt, with a dark beard and a heavy coat. Some said he'd asked for work. Others swore He was simply watching the young women as they walked home. Sheriff Bickford dispatched deputies to neighboring towns to inquire about drifters or traveling laborers matching that description. But no credible leads emerged. Still, the idea of an outsider brought a small measure of comfort to the townspeople. After all, if the killer was a stranger, that meant the evil hadn't come from within their own ranks. But the sheriff wasn't convinced. A man doesn't wander into town, commit a murder, and vanish without trace, he told a reporter. Someone here knows something. As the weeks passed, contradictions began to pile up. One witness swore she saw Cordelia walking alone past the general store. Another claimed she was speaking with a man near the bridge. Some insisted she looked frightened, while others said she appeared calm. And then there was the issue of the missing locket. Clara Poirier reported that Cordelia had worn a small silver locket every day, a keepsake from her grandmother. It wasn't found on her body. For the sheriff, that missing trinket became a crucial detail. If the killer had taken it, was it a trophy? A memento? Or had it been lost in the struggle, waiting somewhere along the riverbank to tell its own story? But before the search could turn up any new leads, the weather turned bitter. Heavy rains washed away much of the evidence near the water. Footprints disappeared, and the river swelled, swallowing anything that might have remained. By winter, the investigation had gone cold. No arrests were made. Henry Lavoie left town under the weight of suspicion. Joseph Poirier withdrew entirely, seldom seen outside his home. And for the people of Biddeford, the unease that had once been fear transformed into resignation. Reporters stopped coming. The sheriff moved on to other duties. Cordelia's case slipped from headlines into whispers, the kind that surface only on cold nights, when someone recalls the girl by the river. But even as the years passed, one haunting question remained. Did the evidence ever truly point to anyone? Or was Cordelia's killer still there all along, hiding in plain sight, protected by silence and the passage of time? By the time winter began to fade into spring, the town of Biddeford had grown eerily quiet. Months had passed since the discovery of 12-year-old Cordelia Poirier's body, and with no clear answers, the townspeople had settled into a tense, uneasy rhythm of waiting. It seemed as though the case might fade into the archives of local gossip until an unexpected announcement reignited the fire. Sheriff Thomas Bickford called a press gathering outside his office one gray March morning and declared that an arrest had been made. The accused was 23-year-old Henry Lavoie, a factory hand who had known Cordelia through her older brother. The sheriff's words rippled through the crowd like a spark through dry grass. After months of fear and speculation, the people of Biddeford finally had a name, a suspect. But in the quiet corners of the town, whispers began to stir. Was this really justice, or simply desperation in disguise? According to the sheriff, an anonymous witness had come forward, claiming to have overheard an argument between Henry and Cordelia on the night she disappeared. The confrontation, they alleged, grew heated, though no one could pinpoint exactly where or when it happened. There were no physical witnesses, no solid proof, just the weight of rumor and the town's hunger for closure. Still, in a community shaken by grief, that was enough. Henry was arrested, and within hours. His face appeared in the Biddeford Chronicle, under the headline, "Mill Worker Charged in Girl's Grisly Death." The newspaper's words painted him as a monster before the trial had even begun. And with every reprint, his guilt seemed to grow in the public imagination. Henry, for his part, denied everything. "I liked her," he reportedly told a journalist during his arraignment. "I'd never hurt her. But people here will believe what they want to believe." His calmness, instead of inspiring sympathy, was viewed by many as cold indifference. The town divided sharply, some convinced of his guilt, others quietly uneasy with how quickly things had escalated. In 1902, in a world without forensic science or modern investigative tools. Guilt was often determined by instinct rather than evidence. When the trial opened that summer, the small courthouse was overflowing. People queued outside from dawn, clutching newspapers and murmuring about what they expected to hear. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The prosecution's case was almost entirely circumstantial. They spoke of Henry's supposed fascination with Cordelia, the mud found on his jacket, and the mysterious witness who claimed to have heard raised voices. They painted a story of jealousy, impulse, and guilt, one that was easy to understand and even easier to believe. No physical evidence connected him to the crime. But to the public, that no longer seemed to matter. Henry's defense attorney, a young and idealistic man named Samuel Hayes, fought to challenge the narrative. He reminded the court that there were no fingerprints, no bloodstains, no direct proof at all. "You want someone to blame," he told the jury, his voice steady but impassioned. "But you don't want to look too closely at the truth." He hinted that the investigation had been mishandled, that evidence had been lost or ignored. He even questioned whether the sheriff had been pressured to make an arrest simply to appease a frightened town. But in the end, reason stood little chance against fear. After less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict guilty of second-degree murder. Henry Lavoie was sentenced to life in Thomaston Prison. When the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted. Some people cheered, others wept. And yet, in the quiet corner near the back, a few sat in stunned silence. For them, something about the case had never felt right. But any doubts that lingered were quickly buried beneath the relief of a community that finally had an answer. However uncertain, then, only days later, everything changed again. A group of boys playing near the riverbank stumbled upon an object wedged between two stones, a small silver locket engraved with the initials CP. Inside was a faded photograph of a woman, later confirmed to be Cordelia's grandmother. The chilling part wasn't the locket itself, but where it had been found, half a mile upstream from where Cordelia's body was discovered. The location directly contradicted the prosecution's timeline. Reporters seized on the discovery immediately, splashing headlines across Maine. New evidence in Poirier case. Could convicted man be innocent? Public opinion began to shift. The same papers that had condemned Henry now questioned whether justice had been too hastily served. But by then, the machinery of the legal system had already moved on. Henry's appeal was denied. The locket was logged as inconclusive, and the town once again tried to make peace with its uncertainty. In the months that followed, Cordelia's case transformed from tragedy into spectacle. Newspapers from across the region competed to tell her story, often embellishing or distorting the facts. Some portrayed her as a saintly child, a symbol of innocence destroyed. Others painted her as naive and too trusting a narrative that implicitly blamed her for her own death. It was cruel, but not unusual. The early 20th century press thrived on moral extremes. Women were angels or temptresses. Men were protectors or predators. There was no room for the messy gray areas where truth often hides. Perhaps what shocked people most wasn't just the crime, one columnist later reflected, but what it revealed about society at the time, a world eager to find villains, yet unwilling to confront its own darkness. Cordelia's story became a mirror for broader anxieties. Industrial towns like Biddeford were changing rapidly, factories humming through the night, immigrants arriving daily, young women entering the workforce and testing the boundaries of traditional life. The fear and fascination surrounding her murder reflected a deeper tension between progress and morality, between freedom and fear. In the years that followed, Henry Lavoie's name slipped quietly from the headlines. Some claimed he confessed before his death. Others insisted he died protesting his innocence. No one ever proved either claim true. What remained was a haunting sense that the wrong man might have paid the price for another's crime. And so, the case of Cordelia Poirier faded into silence. The factory reopened. Families moved on. Children grew up hearing fragments of the story, whispered as warning of a girl too trusting, of a man too unlucky, and of a town that wanted answers more than it wanted truth. Even now, more than a century later, one can't help but wonder, was justice ever truly served? Or did the real killer, unseen and unpunished, simply disappear into the passing tide, leaving behind only questions that no one could ever quite answer? In the years that followed the conviction of Henry Lavoie, time began to dull the sharp edges of the tragedy, at least on the surface. Biddeford returned to its usual rhythm, the clatter of factory machines, the distant whistle of trains, the sound of church bells echoing on quiet mornings. Yet beneath that ordinary calm, something still lingered. The story of Cordelia Poirier refused to die. It lived in whispers and the uneasy glances exchanged by townspeople who had once sworn they knew what happened. It haunted the very ground where she had lived and died. Because even after all the headlines, the trials, and the grief, too many questions had never been answered. For one, there was the matter of the timeline. Cordelia was last seen near the footpath that ran behind the mill pond, at least, according to one neighbor's account. Yet another insisted she'd been spotted nearly half a mile away, heading toward the old stone bridge that crossed the Saco River. Both witnesses were adamant, but their stories couldn't both be true. If the bridge sighting was correct, it meant Cordelia had strayed far from home in her final moments, something that didn't fit with what anyone knew about her. She'd been frightened of the river, her family said, ever since she'd fallen into it as a child. So what would drive her to walk that way alone, after dark? Then there was the locket, the small silver piece discovered months after Henry's conviction. Its location, far from the supposed crime scene, contradicted nearly every detail the prosecution had presented. The defense had argued it was proof the real killer could have led her elsewhere. The sheriff, on the other hand, dismissed it as coincidence. The river carries things where it will, he'd said. But was that really the case? Or had the locket been deliberately planted to mislead investigators? Or perhaps to absolve someone else entirely? Decades later, as true crime writers and local historians began revisiting Cordelia's story, other inconsistencies began to surface. The anonymous witness, whose testimony had played a key role in convicting Henry, was never formally identified. No one could produce records confirming their existence. Some speculated that the witness might have been invented by investigators desperate to close the case. Others believed that whoever came forward had done so out of fear of retaliation, or fear of revealing a secret that implicated someone close to them. And then there was the curious detail of the boot prints found near the riverbank. In the original report, they were described as larger than a child's, smaller than a grown man's. That line, buried deep within the case file, was almost never mentioned in court. But for those who studied the records years later, it raised disturbing possibilities. Could the killer have been a teenager someone Cordelia knew and trusted? Someone who could disappear into the crowd without notice? If that were true, it would explain the silence that followed. It would explain why, even after the verdict, the townspeople never quite looked satisfied. Perhaps they knew or suspected the truth, but found it easier to let the story die than to face it. By the mid-20th century, nearly everyone connected to the case had passed away. The courthouse burned down in 1947, taking with it most of the original trial documents. All that remained were newspaper clippings, fragments of letters, and the fading memories of descendants who still whispered about the girl by the river. Each retelling added something new and lost something old, until fact and folklore became indistinguishable. In the 1970s, a retired journalist named Paul Dupree attempted to piece the story back together. He tracked down what little remained of the records, comparing them to first-hand accounts passed down through families. His conclusion was chilling. He believed Cordelia's death had been covered up not by one person, but by the community itself. They couldn't bear the truth, he wrote in his notes. So they built a lie they could live with. Whether Dupree was right or not remains uncertain. His papers were never formally published, and his notes were scattered after his death. But his words echoed what many had long suspected, that the truth about Cordelia Poirier had been buried under layers of fear, guilt, and time. And so, even now, more than a century after her murder, the mystery endures. Some say her spirit still lingers by the river on cold nights, that her reflection can be seen in the water when the moon is full. Others insist it's just folklore a way for a town to cope with its lingering sense of shame. But maybe there's something deeper to it. Maybe stories like Cordelia's persist because they remind us of something uncomfortable, that justice isn't always truth, and closure doesn't always mean peace. And so, decades later, the truth remains just out of reach, drifting somewhere in the fog, between innocence and guilt, between memory and myth.